In a country made up of more than one kind of people, it has to be the right of every person breathing. It has to be a given for every household, every arm, every elbow, hand to hand. Those of us with the power to speak, must march to recreate the arc of our own history. The future must become a door we all can walk through. So we have to be willing to fight for more than what makes us comfortable. Because what makes us human is the acknowledgement of a universal humanity.
My name is Elnatan, and I made this film. Here's my story. I'm not an expert in political science, foreign relations, or government. I am definitely not a history geek or a socialist either. I am a 20-year-old undergraduate student at some not very well-known community college in Maryland. I came to the US of A 3 years ago from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Yeah, it's quite a trip. 16 hours to be precise. Right away, many people ask me, what is it like growing up in Ethiopia? Do you see a lot of starving children? Were you one of those starving children? Do you see a lot of wildlife? And the one I personally like, have you ever killed a lion with one of those spears you guys have over there? Back home, many of the people I saw outside of family and friends were experiencing severe poverty. And to me, it was because they weren't fortunate enough, or I was just blessed to have been given the resources that I had, and accepted the idea that poverty was misfortune, something that was uncontrollable and very hard to change. Because it's just the simple fact of where you're born, or if you were born into a family that has money, or not. And I am certain that most people have this mentality of poverty being a doing of destiny or luck. We've somehow made ourselves believe that poverty is not under our control. It's something beyond. And it's very easy to come to that conclusion that people in poverty are merely stuck in poverty because of plain old bad luck. But what if we look at poverty in a different way? What if we start by asking questions like, what causes poverty? Who are the main characters? And what are the solutions that can be widely accepted as solutions that can end poverty? These, I believe, are the right questions that will change your view of poverty, and the answer will definitely surprise you.
2008 was a year that many investors around the world will want to forget. With plunging home prices and rising foreclosures, the housing problem snowballed into an economic crisis that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, spreading across the globe. Power Lunch takes a look back after the fall of Lehman and when the government stepped in just before a near total collapse of the financial system.
We are working on now is an approach to deal with the systemic risk and the stresses in our capital markets.
The federal government should interfere in the marketplace only when necessary, given the precarious state of today's financial markets and their vital importance to the daily lives of the American people. Government intervention is not only warranted, it is essential.
We have gotten closer to where we think it ought to be, starting from what they sent us. We're not quite there yet. We are going to continue to work on it.
And we are not sending a blank check to Wall Street.
The government has given us a lifeline. We appreciate the fact that they've done it. We want to repay that loan just as quickly as we can.
This is not a handout to individual institutions. This is trying to make the market as a whole work.
I'm frustrated. The taxpayer is on the hook. The taxpayer is already on the hook. The taxpayer already is going to suffer the consequences if things don't work the way they should work.
We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action.
We've experienced significant turmoil in our financial markets in the last few days, including the collapse of Washington Mutual and Wachovia here, and the failure of two major financial institutions in Europe.
Anyone who watched CNBC's coverage saw a direct juxtaposition. One half of the screen showed this House floor. The other half of the screen showed the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. With each new no vote, the Dow lost points and greater panic spread throughout the trading floor.
This is a pain that will stay with me for the rest of my life.
The federal government will use a portion of the $700 billion financial rescue plan to inject capital into banks by purchasing equity shares. This new capital will help healthy banks continue making loans to businesses and consumers.
Today's actions are not what we ever wanted to do, but today's actions are what we must do to restore confidence in our financial system.
The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines poverty as the lack of something, which is a very broad definition. From here you can say poverty is the lack of resources or the lack of capital, and these definitions of poverty are widely accepted. But the interesting thing is, if you look at a country that is extremely wealthy, which most likely means that the country has no lack of natural resources or capital, you can still feel the pressure of poverty. Millions of people are struggling with poverty even though their country is extremely wealthy. Why? Take the US for example. It is with no doubt the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world, with more wealth than the combined treasures of the next 4 richest nations: Japan, China, Germany, and the UK. In terms of military strength, the US spends more than the next 26 military superpowers combined. But yet over 47 million Americans live in poverty. And here's why. What if I told you that the main cause of poverty is not the lack of resources or the lack of capital? What if I told you that the main cause of poverty is inequality?
Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
So is this a reform movement, something that results in some kind of constitutional amendment, or is this a revolutionary movement?
I don't care. You can call it whatever you want.
Would hope that for these people who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, they will look around them and say there is something more important in life than the richest people becoming richer when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. How can anybody be proud to say that I'm a multi-millionaire and I'm getting a huge tax break and 1/4 of the kids in this country is on food stamps? How do you be proud of that? I don't know.
It's not about unanimity. We're going to be like a Duke Ellington jazz orchestra. Everybody got their own voice, and even Duke is not the conductor. He's just one voice among the others, but hit it, Gonzalez. Hit it, Johnny Hodges. Yes, that's democracy in action at the deepest level.
People are seeing what the government actually is. They're seeing the empire, what it actually stands for. And what you're seeing is all these repressive laws being passed, all these acts, NDAA, SOPA, HIPAA. People's mindsets are changing. People's mindsets are becoming much more, I guess what I can say is much more open to the fact that this government no longer represents the people, and the people are going to take this country back.
The media wants to know who organized this. Who organized this? Who organized all this? I'll tell you who organized it. Bank of America organized it. Chase Bank organized it. Citibank organized it. Exxon Mobil organized it. BP organized it. That's who organized this. Thank you. Thank you, Bank of America, for organizing it.
The Occupy movement, or Occupy Wall Street, was a movement against corporate greed. The movement's prime concerns deal with how large corporations and the global financial system control the world in a way that unreasonably benefits a minority, undermines democracy, and is unstable. You might have heard of the term 99%, which is the slogan used by the Occupy movement to refer to the income inequality and wealth distribution in the US between the wealthiest 1% and the rest of the population. The first Occupy protest to receive widespread attention was Occupy Wall Street in New York City's Zuccotti Park, which began on September 17, 2011. By October 9, Occupy protests had taken place or were ongoing in over 950 cities and over 600 communities in the United States. Thanks to the Occupy movement, now everyone is talking about how the richest 1% have captured such an uneven share of wealth. Even though many people are aware of corporate greed in the US, the global scale of inequality remains largely absent. These companies and their respective CEOs aren't only focused on the US or their respective countries. These organizations are internationally alive and scheming money all over the world. I used to believe that the only way to help the poor in my country was through giving, and giving and giving, because really that's the most logical thing to do. The more charitable people are, the less there is of poverty. But wait, how can I ensure that the money gets to the people that need it most? NGOs and international organizations to fight to end poverty, of course. But don't forget the countries that give billions of dollars in aid too. Without them, fighting poverty would be impossible. Right? Well, no. The harsh truth is that international aid groups and NGOs are hostages to these corporate giants. The international institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization impose free trade and open market economic policies on developing countries over the past few decades. These policies are designed to forcibly privatize, and they're prying them open in order to give multinational corporations exceptional access to cheap land, resources, and labor, but at a serious cost. Poor countries have lost around $500 billion per year in GDP as a consequence of these policies.
Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I've found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries, on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules.
So what we see now is a transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries, and it's been happening for a long time. And how come we haven't known about this sooner? Well, this is where the famous aid idea comes in. Corporations intentionally use the faces of international aid groups to divert the attention of the people from the billions they snatch from these poor countries and focus our attention on aid and how much of a difference we can make by donating our money. And to be honest, they have prospered by marketing this idea, and they keep on prospering.
God has blessed us with such an abundant natural resource. Now, the paradox is that Zambia is ranked among the bottom 20 in terms of poverty, 20 poorest countries. We are wealthy, yet we are poor.
The problem is no longer so much one of absolute poverty, it's become one of inequality, and Zambia is really a case in point for this.
A lot of people think that we in the West have been extremely generous in the amount of foreign aid that we provide to the developing countries, and particularly to Africa. Globally, our estimate is that the amount of money flowing out of developing countries is 10 times the amount of foreign aid flowing into developing countries.
Between 2001 and 2008, the price on copper nearly quadrupled. Yet, despite the boom, the foreign investors paid virtually nothing in profit tax in Zambia.
Another way these corporations steal money is by tax avoidance. Tax avoidance alone accounts for more than $900 billion each year. Money that corporations steal from developing countries and hide in tax havens. What are tax havens again?
The name of the game is to shift your profits out of the high-tax countries, the onshore countries such as in Africa, where the profits are actually being made, and shift them artificially into low-tax countries, into tax havens where they won't be taxed or won't be taxed properly. The way that this is done is by multinational groups, is that they have subsidiaries all around the world, and these subsidiaries trade with each other. And they can artificially manipulate the prices of these trades for bookkeeping purposes, for accounting purposes. The tax haven subsidiary will buy something cheaply and sell it on much more expensively, and between that gap there's a huge profit, but they won't be taxed in the tax haven.
Here's another way: land grabs. For example, according to Fred Pierce's new research, land exceeding the size of Western Europe has been grabbed from developing countries by corporations in the past decade alone. If we could quantify the value of that land, we could have added a huge amount to the 2 trillion stack of cash that the video shows flowing from poor countries to rich.
Poverty is created first by grabbing the resources of the people. Africa, a continent whose poverty is deeply linked to the appropriation of land, historically and today, the biggest land grab taking place in history, is creating new poor people. But new poverty is being created in the heart of affluence, in Europe, in America.
But I mean, does it really matter? If you look at the OECD countries, the people there have got a reasonable standard of living and have had for a long time, and yet there is also inequality. So does it matter as long as people are lifted out of poverty where there are just a few getting rich?
Well, the point is, we are living in times where the new wealth is highly concentrated in a few people's hands, and there is a new language of oligarchy emerging. Now, in my country, I've analyzed the handful of new oligarchs who've made it to the 10 top billionaires, grabbed the land of the people, benefited from the privatization of electricity, so poor people have lost access to electricity.
So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer as a result. Are you seeing a clear link there?
It's totally interconnected, because if water's privatized, of course one company makes more wealth, but people get cholera because they lost their access to drinking water. If seed is patented and privatized, 250,000 Indian farmers commit suicide. Debt.
I think the figure is what, 270,000 have killed themselves over the last 15 years.
Debt, all related to mechanisms of creating wealth by taking away the commons of the people.
Just sticking on this specific...
Or consider climate change. A 2-degree rise in global temperature will cost regions like Africa and South Asia about 5% of their GDP, much more than rich countries will suffer, despite the fact that they bear most of the responsibility for causing the global warming disaster in the first place. Losses on this level make aid seem insignificant. So, one question that arises is why the government of these poorer countries can't override the influences of these corporations. And the sad truth is that the World Bank and the IMF have the power to force economic policies on developing countries, even when voters and elected politicians in those countries totally reject them. On top of this, they enjoy sovereign immunity, status that protects them from lawsuits when their loans fail and their policies cause economic crisis and human devastation. In other words, not only are these corporations undemocratic, they also damage local democracies. and override the will of voters in independent nations. The people affected have no alternative to justice. So now we see that the majority of the world's biggest economic entities are now corporations, not countries. They are run by CEOs who are unelected and unaccountable to any citizens. They are responsible only to their shareholders. Their obligation is to run as much profit as possible at whatever cost to human life or the planet. Here are some of the solutions presented by the End of Poverty organization. If you want to jump on board to fight, go to theendofpoverty.com and sign the petition, or visit inequality.org to get access to research and solutions that are being implemented to end poverty.